The September wind carried the smell of coal smoke and animal dung across the wooden platform, mixing with Clara's fear until she thought she might vomit right there on the warped planks. She'd been standing in the same spot for 6 hours now, watching the sun drag itself across the Wyoming sky like it had all the time in the world, and she had none. Her feet hurt. The boots she'd bought in Philadelphia, good leather, the shopwoman had promised, worth every penny, had rubbed blisters on both heels during the 3-day train ride west. Now the blisters had blisters, and standing still somehow made it worse than walking. But she couldn't walk anywhere. She had to wait. Thomas Carpenter had written in his letters that he'd be at the depot the moment the westbound train arrived, and Thomas Carpenter struck her as a man who kept his word. Except he wasn't here. Clara shifted her weight and tried not to look as desperate as she felt. 2 other women had gotten off the train with her, mining wives reuniting with husbands, both of them swept up in embraces before Clara had even collected her bag from the porter. She'd watched them disappear down the dirt road in wagons, laughing, and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the wind. The platform had been crowded at first. Ranch hands collecting freight. A family heading further west. A traveling preacher who'd tried to save her soul while they waited for different connections, his breath smelling like he'd been drinking something stronger than salvation. But one by one they'd all scattered into the territory, sucked up by the vast emptiness like drops of water on hot stone. Now it was just Clara and the station master, a dried-up man with a face like old saddle leather who kept glancing at her like she was a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet. "Miss," he said, not unkindly, "train heading back east comes through day after tomorrow. Might want to consider it." "I'm being met," Clara said, trying to sound confident instead of desperate. "Mr. Carpenter is coming." The station master made a noise that could have meant anything. "Been here 30 years, seen a lot of folks waiting for people who don't show." He wasn't trying to be cruel. That was the worst part. He was just stating facts, the way you'd comment on the weather or the price of cattle. Out here, apparently, abandoned women were common as dust. Clara's hands tightened on the handle of her carpet bag. Everything she owned was in there. 3 dresses, undergarments, her mother's cameo brooch, a book of poetry she'd read so many times the spine had cracked, and $14 in coins sewn into the lining. $14. In Philadelphia, that might have lasted her 2 weeks if she was careful. Out here, she had no idea if it was a fortune or nothing at all. The sun touched the horizon, turning the whole sky the color of a healing bruise, purple and gold and deep, angry red. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, because she'd imagined watching sunsets like this with Thomas. She'd imagined a lot of things. His letters had been so specific. The ranch was 40 miles north, he'd written, nestled in a valley with good water and protected from the worst winds. He ran cattle, a small herd but growing. The cabin needed a woman's touch. He needed a wife. When Clara had written back, carefully, properly, the way her mother had taught her before the fever took her, Thomas had responded with what felt like genuine affection. Not poetry exactly, but solid and real. He'd sent money for the train ticket. He'd described the life they'd built together. And now the platform was empty, and the station master was locking the depot office, and Clara was still standing there like an idiot, waiting for a man who clearly wasn't coming. "I gotta close up," the station master said, jangling his keys. "Town's a quarter mile that way. Boarding house might have a room, though Mrs. Henderson don't usually take single women without references." "I have money," Clara said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Ain't about money, miss. It's about respectability." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was explaining how rain makes things wet. Single woman traveling alone, no husband, no family. Folks get ideas. Clara felt heat rise in her face. "I came here to be married." "Well?" The station master looked uncomfortable now, like he regretted saying anything. "Seems like that didn't work out how you planned. I'm sorry for it, but I still gotta lock up." He walked away, leaving Clara standing on the platform as darkness rolled in from the east like a physical thing. She could see lights starting to glow in the town, oil lamps in windows, a few scattered buildings that probably constituted the entire settlement. Somewhere out there, 40 miles north, was the cabin Thomas had described. The life she'd traveled all this way to claim, except Thomas didn't want her to claim it anymore. Or maybe he'd never wanted her at all. Clara had spent 6 months working in a garment factory after her mother died, sleeping in a room she shared with 4 other women, eating stale bread and watery soup, saving every penny she could because she'd understood with perfect clarity that Philadelphia offered her nothing except slow death by exhaustion. When Thomas's advertisement had appeared in the Matrimonial Gazette, honest rancher seeking educated wife, Wyoming Territory, good prospects, she'd written to him the same day. She wasn't naive. She knew frontier marriages were transactions as much as romances. Men needed wives to cook and clean and bear children. Women needed security and homes and something better than factory work. It was practical, sensible. But somewhere during those months of letters, Clara had let herself hope for something more. Thomas wrote about the mountains, the changing seasons, the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. He'd seemed kind. Lonely, maybe, but kind. She'd let herself imagine conversations by the fire, growing old together, mattering to someone again. Standing on that platform in the dark, carpetbag cutting into her palm, Clara felt stupid for hoping. The wind picked up, colder now, carrying the promise of the brutal winter everyone on the train had warned her about. Wyoming winters could kill you, a freight handler had said cheerfully. Snows deeper than a horse's head. Temperatures that froze spit before it hit the ground. People died out here every year, he'd said, like it was something to be proud of. Clara shivered and started walking toward town. The road was rutted dirt, hard-packed from wagon wheels and horses. Her boots crunched on loose gravel. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. The sound felt lonely in a way she'd never experienced in Philadelphia, where noise pressed in from all sides constantly. This was different. This was emptiness so complete that sound itself seemed to get swallowed up before it could travel very far. The boarding house the station master had mentioned turned out to be a 2-story building that looked like it had been nice about 20 years ago and had given up trying since then. Paint peeled from the clapboards. One of the upstairs shutters hung crooked, but light glowed warm in the windows, and Clara could smell something cooking, meat and onions, that made her stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since morning. There'd been a dining car on the train, but she'd been too nervous and too worried about money to spend any. Now she felt lightheaded and shaky, though that might have been fear as much as hunger. Clara climbed the 3 steps to the porch and knocked. The woman who answered was built like a rain barrel and had eyes that could have cut glass. She looked Clara up and down in one efficient sweep, taking in the carpet bag, the traveling dress wrinkled from 3 days of sitting, the lack of a husband or father or brother or any male relation whatsoever. "Help you?" The woman's voice suggested she very much doubted it. "I need a room," Clara said, trying for dignity. "Just for tonight. I can pay." "You got references?" No. I just arrived on the westbound train." The woman, Mrs. Henderson presumably, crossed her arms. "We don't take single women without proper introduction. Causes talk." "I'm not—" Clara stopped, swallowed her pride, tried again. "I came here to be married. The gentleman was supposed to meet me at the depot, but he hasn't arrived yet. I just need somewhere to sleep until he comes." Something shifted in Mrs. Henderson's expression, though Clara couldn't tell if it was sympathy or satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed. "What gentleman?" "Thomas Carpenter. He has a ranch north of here." "Carpenter?" Mrs. Henderson snorted. "That explains it." Clara's stomach dropped. "Explains what?" "Tom Carpenter ain't shown his face in town for 6 weeks. Word is he took sick. Real sick." Mrs. Henderson didn't look particularly sorry about this. "Didn't nobody mention it to you?" The platform seemed to tilt under Clara's feet, even though she was standing on solid porch boards. "No. Nobody mentioned anything. I have his letters. He sent money for the train ticket. He said he'd meet me." "Well, he ain't here, is he?" Mrs. Henderson's voice wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the voice of someone who'd seen this particular tragedy play out before and had no patience left for it. "Look, miss, I'm sorry your situation didn't work out, but I got a business to run. I can't have unattached women staying here. It ain't proper." "I have money," Clara said again, hearing the desperation creep into her voice and hating it. "I can pay whatever you ask." "It ain't about money. It's about reputation. Mine and yours." Mrs. Henderson started to close the door. "There's a hotel 2 streets over. They're less particular." The door shut with a solid thunk that felt like a physical blow. Clara stood on the porch, shaking now, though whether from cold or rage or fear she couldn't tell. Probably all three. Behind her, the street was dark except for scattered pools of lamplight. She could see the hotel Mrs. Henderson had mentioned, a squat building with a faded sign and two drunk men sitting on the steps passing a bottle back and forth. She'd rather sleep in the dirt. Clara turned and walked back toward the depot, because at least there she'd be alone. At least there nobody would look at her like she was something shameful. The platform was completely dark now. Clara sat down on the bench the station master had probably put there 30 years ago, set her carpet bag beside her, and let herself feel the full weight of how badly she'd miscalculated everything. She'd burned every bridge in Philadelphia, given up her room at the boarding house, quit her factory job, said goodbye to the few friends she'd made. There was nothing to go back to, even if she had money for the return ticket, which she didn't. Not really. $14 might get her halfway across the country if she didn't eat, but then what? Arrive back east as destitute as she'd left, except now with failed mail-order bride attached to her name? The wind cut through her dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in heat that wasn't there. Above her, stars came out in numbers she'd never seen in Philadelphia, where smoke and streetlights washed out half the sky. Here they were so thick they looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. Beautiful and completely indifferent to whether she lived or died. Clara had just started seriously considering whether she could break into the depot and sleep inside. Was it really breaking in if she wasn't stealing anything? When she heard hoofbeats, a single horse moving at a steady trot. The sound carried clearly in the still air, growing louder as it approached town. Clara stood up, hope and fear tangling in her chest. Maybe Thomas had come after all. Maybe he'd been delayed. Maybe the sickness wasn't as bad as Mrs. Henderson thought. Maybe the rider came into view and Clara's hope died. This wasn't Thomas Carpenter. Thomas's letters had described himself as fair-haired and of average build, pleasant features. The man swinging down from a rangy buckskin horse was none of those things. He was tall and dark-haired and moved like someone who'd spent more time fighting than farming. Even in the dim light from the station office window, Clara could see scars, one across his left eyebrow, another along his jaw. He wore range clothes that had seen hard use, and a revolver hung from his belt in a holster worn smooth from handling. He looked dangerous. Not in the way the drunk men at the hotel looked dangerous, sloppy, and mean. This was different. This was controlled and competent, and maybe a little dead behind the eyes. He saw Clara and stopped, one hand resting casual-like on the hitching rail, but positioned, she noticed, very close to that revolver. "You Clara Whitmore?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. Clara's heart hammered. "Yes." "Who are you?" "Rhett Mercer. Tom Carpenter sent me." Relief flooded through her so fast she felt dizzy. "Is he all right? Mrs. Henderson said he was sick." "He's alive." Mercer's tone suggested this wasn't necessarily good news. "But he ain't coming to meet you. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Clara stared at him. "I don't understand." Tom took fever back in August. Bad enough he thought he was dying, which he probably was. When a man thinks he's dying, he gets regretful about things, including mail-order brides he sent for but never really intended to marry. The words hit Clara like a fist to the stomach. "What?" "He wrote you when he was lonely and stupid. Then he got sick and scared and guilty. Asked me to come tell you he's sorry, but the arrangement's off." Mercer said it flat and emotionless, like he was reading items off a grocery list. "He'll pay for a return ticket east. That's more than fair." Clara couldn't breathe. The platform, the stars, the whole enormous Wyoming night seemed to press down on her until she thought her knees would buckle. "He sent money for my train ticket. He wrote letters for 6 months. He made promises." "Yeah, well, Tom makes a lot of promises when he's drinking too. Doesn't mean any of them are worth spit." Mercer pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and held it out. "Money's in there. Train leaves day after tomorrow. I'll tell Tom you took it sensible." Clara looked at the envelope like it was a snake. "Where is he?" 40 miles north at his ranch, still weak from the fever but getting better." "Take me to him." Mercer's eyebrows went up a fraction. "Lady, you ain't hearing me. He don't want to marry you. Sending me instead of coming himself should have made that pretty clear." "I heard you just fine." Clara's voice came out harder than she intended, shaking with fury instead of tears. "I crossed half the country based on his promises. I gave up everything I had because Thomas Carpenter convinced me I had a future here. And now you're telling me he changed his mind and I should just accept it? That's about the size of it, yeah. No. The word surprised Clara as much as it seemed to surprise Mercer. No, I'm not accepting it. I want to hear it from him, directly, not from some hired messenger. Mercer's jaw tightened. I ain't hired. I'm a friend doing a favor, and the favor don't include hauling stubborn women across 40 miles of rough country. Then I'll find someone else to take me. There ain't nobody else. And even if there was, Tom ain't gonna change his mind just because you show up on his doorstep making demands. Maybe not. Clara snatched the envelope from Mercer's hand and shoved it into her carpet bag without looking at it. But I'm not leaving Wyoming until I look Thomas Carpenter in the eye and hear him say he's a coward who makes promises he never intended to keep. If that makes me stubborn, fine. I've been called worse. For the first time, something like emotion flickered across Mercer's face. It might have been respect, or possibly just irritation. You got any idea what 40 miles means out here? It ain't a Sunday carriage ride. I don't care if it's 100 miles through hell itself. Clara was shaking now, but not from cold, from rage so pure it felt almost clean. I came here for something I was promised, and I'm not leaving until I at least see what it looks like. Mercer stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not much, just a short bark of sound, but it transformed his face from dangerous to something almost human. You got sand, I'll give you that. He glanced at the dark street behind her. Got anywhere to sleep tonight? Not yet. Boarding house turn you away? Mrs. Henderson has standards. Clara couldn't quite keep the bitterness out of her voice. Yes, she would. Mercer seemed to make some kind of decision. All right. Against my better judgment, I'll take you up to Tom's place. But we leave at first light, and if you slow me down, I'm leaving you wherever you stop. Understood? Understood. There's a stable behind the freight office. Owner won't care if you sleep in the loft long as you don't steal nothing. I'll be there before sunrise. He started to turn away, then stopped. Fair warning, you might not like what you find at the end of that 40 miles. I don't like much of anything right now, Clara said. But at least I'll know. Mercer nodded slowly, like she'd passed some test he hadn't expected her to take. Stable's that way. Try not to freeze to death before morning. He swung back onto his horse and rode off without another word, leaving Clara alone on the platform again. But something had changed. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She had a direction, even if it led somewhere terrible. The stable turned out to be exactly what Mercer had described, a ramshackle building that smelled like horse manure and old hay. Clara climbed the ladder to the loft, found a relatively clean corner, and made herself a nest out of her spare dress and the cleanest horse blanket she could find. It was possibly the worst bed she'd ever slept in. It smelled bad, it itched, and she could hear mice skittering in the rafters. But she was out of the wind, and she was too exhausted to care about much else. Clara lay there in the dark, listening to the horses shift and breathe below, and thought about Thomas Carpenter's letters. She'd read them so many times she had whole passages memorized. The valley here is beautiful in spring, he'd written. Green enough to hurt your eyes after the winter gray. You'd like it, I think. A woman with education and grace could make something fine of this place. Education and grace. As if those things mattered when the man who'd written them turned out to be too much of a coward to face her himself. Clara closed her eyes and made herself a promise. She'd ride 40 miles to that ranch. She'd look Thomas Carpenter in his lying face. She'd tell him exactly what she thought of men who made promises they didn't intend to keep, and then she'd figure out what the hell came next, because going back east wasn't an option, and staying here seemed impossible. Somewhere between planning her revenge and trying not to think about mice, Clara fell asleep. She woke to someone shaking her shoulder and nearly screamed before recognizing Mercer's scarred face in the pre-dawn gloom. Sun's not up yet, he said quietly, but we need to be moving when it is. You got anything needs doing, do it now. Clara sat up, her whole body aching from sleeping on boards. I'm ready. You look like hell. Thank you so much for noticing. That almost smile flickered across his face again. There's a pump behind the stable. Water's cold, but it's clean. I'll get the horses ready. The water was more than cold. It was glacial, probably fed by snowmelt from those mountains she couldn't quite see yet in the darkness. But it shocked Clara awake better than coffee could have, and she used it to wash her face and hands and try to make herself look slightly less like she'd slept in a stable, which, of course, she had. By the time she climbed down from the loft, Mercer had 2 horses saddled, his buckskin and a smaller mare with a calm eye. "You ride?" he asked. "A little." Clara had ridden exactly 3 times in her life, all of them on a very gentle pony at a Philadelphia park. "I'll manage." "Better manage fast. We got a lot of ground to cover." Mercer tied her carpet bag behind her saddle with practiced efficiency. "Stay close and don't wander off. Country out here will kill you if you're stupid about it." "I'll try not to be stupid," Clara said, though privately she thought getting on this horse and riding 40 miles to confront a man who didn't want her probably qualified as the stupidest decision of her life. Mercer swung up onto his buckskin with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. "Last chance to change your mind. Take the money, catch the train, go back to whatever you left." Clara thought about the factory, the shared room, the slow gray death of waking up every day knowing nothing would ever change or improve. Then she thought about Thomas Carpenter's lies and felt her jaw set. "No," she said, and hauled herself awkwardly onto the mare. The horse shifted under her weight, but didn't bolt or buck, which Clara took as a good sign. Mercer studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right then, keep up." He turned his horse north and started riding. Clara kicked her mare into motion and followed him into the Wyoming wilderness, toward a confrontation she probably wasn't ready for and a future she couldn't begin to imagine. The sun rose behind them, painting the eastern sky the color of fresh blood. The first hour of riding was the worst hour of Clara's life, and that included the night her mother died and the 3 days she'd spent on trains smelling other people's sweat and bad food. Her thighs screamed. Her back felt like someone had taken an iron poker to it. The mare beneath her had seemed calm in the stable yard, but now that they were actually moving, the animal had opinions about pace and direction that didn't always match what Clara wanted. Every time she tried to adjust her grip on the reins, her shoulders protested. Every bounce of the horse's gait sent jolts up her spine that made her teeth click together. Mercer rode ahead of her, straight-backed and easy in the saddle like he'd been born there. He didn't look back to check if she was keeping up, didn't slow down. Just maintained that steady, ground-eating pace that probably felt effortless to him and felt like torture to Clara. She'd be damned if she complained. The sun climbed higher, turning the Wyoming landscape from shadow into something Clara had no words for. She'd thought she understood what empty meant. Philadelphia had alleys and corners where nobody went, sure, but there were always buildings hemming you in, always people somewhere nearby even if you couldn't see them. This was different. This was space so vast it made her feel like an insect, something small and insignificant that could be crushed without anyone noticing. The terrain rolled in long swells like a frozen ocean. Sage and scrub grass stretched in every direction, broken up by scattered rocks and the occasional stand of stunted trees that looked like they'd given up trying to grow properly. In the distance, mountains rose dark and jagged against the sky, their peaks still white with snow even though it was September. "Those the Rockies?" Clara called forward, her voice sounding thin in all that openness. Mercer glanced back, the first time he'd acknowledged her existence since they'd left town. "Part of them. We're heading into the foothills." "How far have we come?" "Maybe 6 miles. Clara's heart sank. 6 miles. They had 34 to go, and she already felt like she might die. But she set her jaw and kept riding, because the alternative was admitting defeat, and she'd rather eat broken glass. They stopped at a creek around mid-morning so the horses could drink. Clara slid off her mare and nearly collapsed when her legs buckled. She caught herself on the saddle, pride keeping her upright through sheer force of will. Mercer was already kneeling by the water, refilling a canteen. He didn't comment on her near fall, which she appreciated more than she could say. "Drink," he said, offering her the canteen after he'd taken a long swallow. "Water out here's clean, but you gotta take it when you find it." Clara drank. The water was cold and tasted faintly of minerals, nothing like the flat-treated water that came out of Philadelphia taps. It cut through the dust in her throat, and she drank more than she probably should have, until Mercer took the canteen back with a grunt that might have been approval. "You can walk around a bit if you need to," he said. "Loosen up. We got another 10 minutes before we move." Clara wanted to sit down more than she wanted her next breath, but something about the way he'd phrased it, "if you need to," made her stubborn. She walked along the creek bank instead, forcing her protesting legs to move, trying not to limp. The creek was maybe 6 feet across, shallow enough that she could see rocks on the bottom. Small fish darted between them, quick silver flashes. On the far bank, something had left tracks in the mud. Clara studied them, trying to figure out what kind of animal made prints that big. "Wolf?" Mercer said from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Passed through maybe yesterday. Good-sized one." Clara looked at the print again. It was easily as large as her hand. "Are they dangerous?" "Everything out here's dangerous if you're stupid about it. Wolves mostly leave people alone unless they're starving or rabid. But they'll take livestock if you don't protect it proper." He turned back toward the horses. Time to move. Getting back on the mare was worse than getting off had been. Clara's muscles had stiffened up during the brief rest, and now they screamed protest at being forced back into riding position. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood and didn't make a sound. Mercer swung onto his buckskin and glanced at her. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite sympathy, but maybe understanding. It gets easier after the first few hours. Body adjusts. How encouraging, Clara managed. His mouth twitched. Never said it was fun, just easier. They rode on. The sun climbed higher and hotter than Clara had expected for September. She'd thought Wyoming would be cold all the time, based on the stories about brutal winters, but apparently that didn't apply to autumn days. Sweat trickled down her back under the traveling dress she'd put on 3 days ago, thinking it looked proper for meeting a future husband. Now it just felt heavy and confining, the wool fabric trapping heat against her skin. The landscape changed as they climbed into the foothills. The rolling grassland gave way to rougher terrain, rocky outcrops, steep-sided gullies, patches of pine trees that provided brief shade before they emerged back into sunlight. They followed what might have been a trail or might have just been the path of least resistance through the wilderness. Clara couldn't tell. To her city eyes, it all looked equally impassable. Around noon, Mercer stopped at a flat stretch under some pines and swung down. "We'll rest here. Eat something if you got it." Clara hadn't brought food. She'd left Philadelphia with a small lunch packed by her boarding house, but that was 3 days gone. Since then, she'd been too nervous or too broke or too proud to eat much of anything. Now her stomach cramped with hunger, but she wasn't about to admit she'd ridden into the wilderness unprepared. Mercer pulled something from his saddlebag, dried meat and hard biscuits that looked like they could double as roofing tiles. He broke the food in half and handed Clara a portion without comment. "Thank you," she said quietly. He just nodded and sat down with his back against a tree, eating in silence. The dried meat was salty and tough enough that Clara's jaw ached from chewing, but it was food and she was grateful for it. The biscuit was better once she'd softened it with water from the canteen. They ate without talking, the only sounds the horses cropping grass and wind moving through pine branches overhead. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said after a while. Mercer looked at her, waiting. "Why did you agree to do this? Deliver his message, I mean." "Tom and I go back a ways. He asked a favor." Mercer shrugged like that explained everything. "Maybe out here it did." "You don't seem like the kind of man who runs errands for cowards." That got a reaction. His eyebrows went up slightly and something that might have been amusement touched his scarred face. "You got opinions about what kind of man I am?" "I've got eyes." Clara met his gaze steadily. "And I've met enough men to recognize the difference between someone who faces things direct and someone who hides behind others. You strike me as the former, which makes me wonder why you're helping the latter." Mercer studied her for a long moment, long enough that Clara wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he said, "Tom's not a bad man. He's just weak. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yeah. Bad men do harm on purpose. Weak men just collapse under pressure and hurt people by accident." He paused. "Don't make the hurt any less real, I suppose. But it ain't the same as malice." Clara thought about that. "He still should have faced me himself." "Probably." Mercer stood up and brushed pine needles off his pants. "But he didn't, so here we are. You about ready to move?" Clara's whole body screamed no, but she stood anyway. Ready. The afternoon was worse than the morning. The brief rest had given her muscles time to fully register their complaints, and now every step the mare took felt like a fresh insult. The sun blazed down without mercy. Clara's face felt tight and hot, probably sunburned, though she'd never had that problem in Philadelphia where buildings blocked most direct light. She tried to distract herself by studying the landscape, looking for anything interesting. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with barely a wing beat. Lizards skittered across rocks when they passed. Once, a deer bounded away through the trees, white tail flashing. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way that made her Philadelphia life feel small and gray by comparison. Around mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge and the valley spread out below them. Clara pulled the mare to a stop, staring. It was bigger than she'd imagined. The valley floor stretched maybe 2 miles across, hemmed in by steep hillsides thick with pine and aspen. A creek, bigger than the one they'd stopped at earlier, wound through the center, glinting in the sun. She could see the dark shapes of cattle scattered across the grassland, and near the far end, a cluster of buildings that must be Thomas Carpenter's ranch. From this distance, it looked almost picturesque. A cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. A barn. Corrals and outbuildings. The kind of scene that would have fit perfectly in one of those romantic stories about frontier life that Clara had read back east, where everything was adventure and possibility. Up close, she suspected it would look a lot less romantic. Mercer had stopped beside her, following her gaze. "That's Tom's place. Still want to do this? I didn't ride 15 hours to turn back now." "Closer to 8 hours, but point taken." He nudged his horse forward. "Fair warning, Tom's not going to be happy to see you." "Good," Clara said. "I'm not happy to see him either." They made their way down into the valley as the sun started its long slide toward the mountains. The temperature dropped noticeably, something about the elevation and the shade from the surrounding hills. Clara was grateful for it after the afternoon heat, though she knew it meant the nights here got cold. As they got closer to the ranch, Clara could see how much work the place needed. The barn roof sagged on one side. Several sections of fence had collapsed completely. The cabin itself was solid enough, log construction that looked like it had been there a while, but the whole property had an air of neglect, like nobody had been taking proper care of it for longer than one man's illness could account for. They rode into the yard and Mercer dismounted, tying his horse to a rail outside the cabin. Clara slid off her mare less gracefully, her legs nearly buckling again. Everything hurt. She was pretty sure she'd have bruises in places she didn't know could bruise, but she was here. The cabin door opened and a man stepped out onto the porch. Thomas Carpenter looked nothing like Clara had imagined. His letters had been educated, almost refined in their language. She'd pictured someone neat and careful, maybe a bit soft from indoor work. The man on the porch was sun-weathered and gaunt, his fair hair unkempt, wearing clothes that hung loose like he'd recently lost weight. He looked older than 30, the age he'd claimed in his letters. 40, maybe, or just worn down hard by frontier life. He saw Clara and went pale. "No, Rhett, what the hell?" "She insisted on coming," Mercer said flatly. "Wouldn't take the money, wouldn't get on the train, so I brought her to hear it from you directly." Thomas stared at Clara like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock. Not angry, exactly, just dismayed and maybe a little panicked. "Miss Whitmore, I sent Rhett to explain—" "You sent him to do what you were too cowardly to do yourself," Clara interrupted. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, shaking with exhaustion and fury. "You wrote me letters for 6 months. You sent money for my train ticket. You made promises. And then you changed your mind and expected me to just accept your rejection from a stranger? I was sick. I thought I was dying. So you decided to waste my time and money and future on a whim?" Clara climbed the porch steps, not sure what she was planning to do, but needing to be on his level, not looking up at him like a supplicant. "I gave up everything to come here. Everything. And you couldn't even be bothered to meet me at the depot and tell me to my face?" Thomas flinched. Up close, Clara could see he'd been genuinely sick. His skin had that papery quality of someone who'd lost serious weight, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of bad nights. But she couldn't make herself feel sorry for him. Not when her own situation was so much worse. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and he did sound sorry. That was almost worse than if he'd been cruel. "I really am. But I can't marry you. I thought I could when I was sitting here alone thinking about what I wanted. But wanting something and being able to give a woman a decent life are two different things." "I never asked for decent," Clara shot back. "I asked for honest. I'm being honest now. This ranch is barely surviving. I damn near died from fever because there wasn't anybody here to take care of things proper. You'd be miserable here. Better to know that now than after we're married." "Better for who?" Clara felt something break open in her chest. All the fear and disappointment and rage she'd been holding in since Philadelphia coming out in a rush. You get to make your decisions and change your mind and stay comfortable in your cabin. What about me? I have nowhere to go, no job, no family, barely any money. You brought me out here and now you want to just wash your hands of the whole mess? Thomas looked genuinely distressed now. I said I'd pay for your return ticket. That's more than fair. Fair? Clara laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. You think a train ticket makes this fair? I can't go back to Philadelphia. There's nothing there for me anymore. You promised me a future and now you're trying to buy me off like I'm some inconvenient debt. I don't know what you want me to say. Thomas's voice rose, taking on an edge. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. But I can't fix it by marrying someone I don't love and who'd hate this life inside a month. You don't know what I'd hate. I know this valley kills weak people, Thomas said bluntly. And you're city-bred, educated, like you said in your letters. You probably never worked a day of real labor in your life. One winter out here would break you. Clara felt that like a slap. You're calling me weak? You're the one who ran away from his own promises. I'm calling you realistic. There's no shame in admitting you're not suited for frontier life. I never got the chance to find out if I'm suited for it or not. You decided for me. Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. And now you want me to just accept that and disappear. Well, I won't. This ranch was supposed to be mine too. You promised me that. So either you honor your word and marry me, or you pay me what this place is worth, because I gave up my entire life based on your lies. Thomas's face darkened. Now wait just a minute. She's got a point, Mercer said quietly. Both Clara and Thomas turned to stare at him. He'd been standing off to the side, watching the argument unfold with that neutral expression he seemed to wear like armor. Now he stepped forward, positioning himself between them without quite seeming to take anyone's side. You made promises, Tom, Mercer continued. Written promises. Paid her way out here. Can't blame her for being angry when you changed the terms. Whose side are you on? Thomas demanded. Nobody's side, just stating facts. Mercer looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. But Miss Whitmore, even if Tom's a coward and a liar, you can't force a man to marry you, and taking his ranch by force of argument ain't legal either. Clara felt tears burn behind her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these men. Then what am I supposed to do? Nobody answered her. The silence stretched out, broken only by wind rattling through the broken fence rails and a cow lowing somewhere in the distance. The sun had nearly touched the western mountains now, throwing long shadows across the valley. In another hour, it would be dark. Finally, Thomas said, You can stay the night. In the barn, there's a room in the loft that's clean enough. Tomorrow I'll give you money for the train and for your trouble. It's the best I can do. The best you can do is pathetic, Clara said, but her voice had lost its fire. She was too exhausted to fight anymore. Too saddle-sore and sunburned and heartsick to keep arguing with a man who'd already made up his mind. She walked off the porch without another word, heading toward the barn, because she didn't know where else to go. Behind her, she heard Mercer say something in a low voice, and Thomas's reply, equally quiet, but she couldn't make out the words and didn't care to. She pushed open the barn door and was hit by the familiar smell of horses and hay and manure, comforting after the stable last night, even if this barn was just as much a reminder of how far she'd fallen. The loft was accessed by a ladder. Clara climbed it mechanically, found the room Thomas had mentioned, a small space with a narrow cot and a single window overlooking the valley, and sat down heavily on the bed. She should cry. That's what women did in stories when their dreams fell apart, right? They cried and maybe fainted, and some man came along to fix everything. But Clara's eyes stayed dry, and her hand stayed steady, and the only thing she felt was a cold, clear anger that seemed to have burned away everything else. She'd been so stupid, believing his letters, imagining a life that never existed, thinking a man she'd never met could offer her something better than what she'd had. Clara lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling rafters. Swallows had built nests up there. She could see the mud structures clustered in the corners. Outside, the light faded from gold to blue to purple. She must have fallen asleep despite everything, because she woke to full darkness and the sound of voices outside. Clara sat up carefully, her body still screaming from the day's ride. Through the loft window she could see lamplight in the cabin and two figures on the porch, Thomas and Mercer, talking. Their voices carried in the still night air. Can't just send her back with nothing, Mercer was saying. I'm giving her money. What more does she want? Maybe an apology that sounds like you mean it. Thomas made a frustrated noise. I do mean it. I just don't know what else to say. Could start by admitting you were using her as a band-aid for your loneliness. You never intended to actually marry anyone. You just wanted to feel like you had a future coming. There was a long pause. Then Thomas said, quieter, maybe. She gave up her whole life, Tom, based on your word. That means something. What do you want me to do? I can't marry her. She'd hate it here, and I'd hate myself for trapping her. So help her get settled somewhere else. Town, maybe. See if Mrs. Henderson needs help at the boarding house. Or the general store might need a clerk, somebody educated who can read and write proper. Thomas snorted. You think Mrs. Henderson's going to hire a disgraced mail-order bride? Be realistic. I think Mrs. Henderson's a pragmatist who'll hire whoever can work. And Miss Whitmore strikes me as someone who can work. Mercer's voice hardened slightly. You owe her that much at least. Help her find a position instead of just throwing money at the problem. Why do you care so much? You met her yesterday. Because somebody should care and you clearly don't. That seemed to hit Thomas hard. Clara heard him sigh. All right, fine. Tomorrow I'll ride into town with her, ask around, see if anyone's hiring. But that's all I can do. After that, she's on her own. That's all anyone's asking. The voices dropped lower, too quiet to hear anymore. Clara lay back down, thinking about what she'd just heard. Mercer defending her. Thomas agreeing to help, however reluctantly. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, but it was better than being put on a train with nowhere to go. She wondered what kind of work she could actually do. The factory had been mindless, repetitive labor. She could do that again if she had to, but Wyoming probably didn't have garment factories. Store clerk might work. Or maybe there was a school that needed teachers, though she'd never taught before and had no idea if they'd let a woman do it. Something would work out. It had to. Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept spinning through possibilities and disasters until dawn light crept through the loft window. When she climbed down the ladder, stiff and sore but determined, she found Mercer waiting by the barn with the horses already saddled. Tom's in the cabin, he said. Says you should come get breakfast before we head to town. Clara nodded and walked toward the cabin, trying not to limp. Her pride was already battered enough without showing more weakness. Thomas had coffee brewing and bacon frying when she entered. The cabin was small and plain inside. One main room with a fireplace, a rough-built table and chairs, and a curtained-off area that must have been his bedroom. Everything was clean but sparse, functional rather than comfortable. Sit, Thomas said without looking at her. Food will be ready in a minute. Clara sat at the table and accepted the coffee he poured. It was strong enough to strip paint, but after the night she'd had, it tasted fine. They ate in silence, bacon, biscuits, and eggs scrambled in the bacon grease. It was more food than Clara had eaten in days, and her stomach cramped a bit, taking it all in, but she forced herself to clean her plate. She'd need the energy for whatever came next. Finally, Thomas said, I talked to Rhett. We'll ride into town, see if anyone needs help. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. Thank you, Clara said, keeping her voice neutral. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something like shame crossed his face. I really am sorry. About all of it. I never meant to hurt anybody. But you did hurt me, Clara said quietly. Intentions don't change that. I know. He stood up and started clearing plates. We should get moving. It's an 8-hour ride back, and I'd like to be there before dark. They left shortly after, Clara back on the borrowed mare, her body protesting every movement. Thomas and Mercer rode on either side of her, both men silent. The valley was beautiful in the early morning light, mist rising from the creek and deer grazing in the meadows. But Clara couldn't appreciate it. She was too focused on not falling off the damn horse. The ride back was somehow worse than the ride out, maybe because her muscles had spent the night stiffening up. Every hour felt like 10. But Clara kept her face blank and didn't complain, because she'd already given these men enough reasons to see her as weak. They stopped for water and rest at the same creek as before. While the horses drank, Thomas said awkwardly, I was thinking, the general store might work. Old man Hendricks has been talking about needing help with the books. You said you could read and write well. I can, Clara confirmed, and Mrs. Henderson might take you at the boarding house if I vouch for you. Tell her you're respectable, just had bad luck. Clara wanted to laugh at that. Bad luck. As if Thomas's betrayal was something that just happened, like weather. But she bit her tongue and nodded. That would be helpful. Mercer, who'd been standing a little ways off, said, "What about the old Walker place?" Thomas frowned. "What about it?" "Been sitting empty since Walker died last spring. Small cabin, good water. Needs work, but it's livable." Mercer looked at Clara. "If you wanted to stay out here instead of town, that might be an option. You'd need to file a claim, but the land's available." Clara stared at him. "I don't know anything about homesteading." "Nobody does until they learn," Mercer said. "And it's yours free and clear if you work it. Might be better than taking orders from Mrs. Henderson for the rest of your life." Thomas looked skeptical. "She's a single woman from Philadelphia. No offense, Miss Whitmore, but homesteading alone would kill you." "Maybe," Mercer said. "Or maybe she's tougher than you think. Rode 8 hours yesterday without complaint, even though I could see she was hurting. Confronted you on your own porch when most women would have cried and gone home. Strikes me as someone who might survive if given the chance." Clara felt something warm flicker in her chest at his words. Someone believing in her. It had been so long since anyone had done that. "I'd like to see this cabin," she heard herself say, "before I decide anything." Thomas sighed. "It's out of the way. Would add 2 hours to the trip." "Then we add 2 hours." Clara met his eyes. "You owe me that much." Thomas couldn't argue with that, so he didn't try. They rode west from the creek, following a deer trail through rougher country. The Walker place turned out to be tucked into a small hollow protected by hills on 3 sides. The cabin was tiny, just one room really, but it was solidly built and the roof looked intact. A creek ran nearby and there was a small clearing that might have been a garden once. It was isolated. More isolated than Thomas's ranch, with no neighbors visible in any direction. But Clara found herself drawn to it anyway. Maybe because it was hers for the taking if she wanted it. Nobody else's promises to break. Nobody else's rules to follow. "Needs work," Thomas said, stating the obvious. "Chimney's probably full of birds' nests. Floor needs patching. And you'd need supplies for winter, more than you could afford." Clara walked through the cabin, touching the walls, testing the floorboards. It smelled musty from disuse, but not rotten. With cleaning and repairs, it could be livable. "What would I have to do to claim it?" she asked. Mercer leaned against the doorframe. "File with the land office in town. Prove you're working the land, clearing, planting, building. After 5 years, it's yours legal." 5 years alone out here?" Thomas shook his head. "That's not realistic." "Why not?" Clara turned to face him. "Because I'm a woman? Because I'm from Philadelphia? You don't know what I can or can't do. I know frontier life breaks people. I've seen it happen." "Then I guess we'll find out if I'm one of the ones who breaks," Clara said. Her voice was steady now, certain. She'd made her decision. "I want to claim this land." Thomas looked at Mercer like he expected help arguing. Mercer just shrugged. "Her choice to make." "This is insane," Thomas muttered. But he didn't try to stop her. They rode the rest of the way to town in tense silence. By the time they arrived, it was late afternoon and Clara hurt so bad she wasn't sure she could walk. But she slid off the mare and forced her legs to hold her weight, because she wasn't giving up now. The land office was a small building next to the general store. Inside, a bored-looking clerk listened to Clara's request, filled out forms in triplicate, and told her the filing fee was $2. Clara counted out coins from her dwindling supply and handed them over. The clerk stamped the forms and gave her a copy. "Congratulations," he said without enthusiasm. "You're now a Wyoming homesteader. Don't die." Outside, Thomas said, "You'll need supplies. Tools, food, blankets, probably another $20 at least." Clara thought about the envelope he'd given Mercer, still unopened in her carpet bag. "How much did you put in there for my train ticket?" $30. "Then I'll use that for supplies instead." Clara met his eyes. "And we're even. You don't owe me anything else." Thomas looked relieved and guilty at the same time. "You sure about this?" "No," Clara said honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." They went to the general store, and Clara spent an hour carefully selecting what she'd need. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, an axe, a saw, nails, blankets, matches, rope. The store owner, Mr. Hendricks, the man Thomas had mentioned, watched her with open curiosity, but rang up the purchases without comment. As Clara was paying, Hendricks said, "You're the mail-order bride Tom didn't marry." It wasn't a question. News apparently traveled fast in small towns. "I am," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "Taking up the Walker claim, I hear." "That's right." Hendricks studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "Need someone to haul freight out there. Let me know. I can't deliver regular, but once a month maybe, for a fee." "Thank you," Clara said, surprised. "I'll remember that." Outside, Mercer helped her load the supplies onto the pack horse Thomas had brought. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of fire. "Getting late," Thomas said. "We should stay in town tonight, head out to Walker's in the morning." "No," Clara shook her head. "I want to go now, while I still have the nerve." Mercer looked at her, something like respect in his scarred face. "All right, I'll ride out with you. Help you get settled. Tom can head home." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but Mercer's expression said the discussion was over. Finally, Thomas nodded. "Good luck, Miss Whitmore. I hope it works out for you." He rode off without waiting for a response. Clara watched him go, feeling nothing. No anger anymore, no disappointment, just a strange emptiness where her future used to be, and the beginning of something new she couldn't quite name yet. "Ready?" Mercer asked. Clara nodded. "Ready." They rode toward the Walker place as stars began appearing overhead. Clara's new life waiting in the darkness ahead. The cabin looked worse by lantern light than it had in daylight. Every crack in the walls seemed wider, every stain on the floor darker, every sign of neglect more pronounced. Clara stood in the doorway holding the lamp Mercer had lit, trying not to let her face show what she was thinking, which was that she'd made a terrible mistake and this place would probably kill her before spring. "It's not much," Mercer said from behind her, stating what they both already knew. "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." But it was hers. That had to count for something. Mercer carried supplies in while Clara investigated the cabin more thoroughly. One room, maybe 12 feet square. A stone fireplace that did indeed have birds' nests clogged in the chimney. She could see sticks and dried grass blocking the flue. A rough wooden floor with gaps between some of the boards wide enough to stick her fingers through. One window with shutters but no glass. A door that hung crooked on leather hinges and didn't close properly. The previous owner had left a few pieces of furniture, a table with one short leg, 2 chairs in various states of disrepair, a bed frame with rope webbing that had rotted through in places. Not much, but more than Clara had owned yesterday. "We should get a fire going," Mercer said, setting down the last bundle of supplies. "Temperature drops fast up here at night." "The chimney's blocked?" "I'll clear it." He grabbed a long stick from the woodpile outside. The previous owner had at least left some cut wood, though it was half rotted from sitting out in the weather, and climbed onto the table to reach up into the chimney. Birds' nests and debris rained down as he worked, covering him in soot and dried grass. He didn't complain, just kept working until the passage was clear. Clara swept the mess out while Mercer built a fire. The kindling caught slowly, smoking badly at first until the draft improved, then settling into a steady burn that pushed back the darkness and cold. The cabin immediately felt more livable with firelight dancing on the walls. "You'll need more wood," Mercer said, brushing soot off his shirt. "What's outside won't last more than a few days. There's dead trees on the north slope. You'll have to cut and haul them yourself." Clara thought about the axe she'd bought, which she'd never actually used. "I don't know how to cut down trees." "Then you'll learn." Mercer's tone wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. "Out here you learn or you die. There's not much middle ground." "That's encouraging." "Wasn't trying to encourage you, just telling you how it is." He glanced around the cabin, cataloging problems. "Floor needs patching before winter. Gaps that big will let in snow and cold air. You'll need to chink the walls too, stuff moss or mud between the logs to seal them proper. And that door needs fixing or every animal in the territory will walk right in." Clara felt overwhelmed by the list of tasks, but she nodded. "How long before I die of inexperience would you estimate?" That almost smile touched Mercer's face. "Hard to say. You're stubborn enough you might last a while." "Is that a compliment?" "Out here it is." They worked through the evening, getting the cabin into something approaching habitable. Mercer fixed the door hinges using leather strips from his saddlebag and rehung it so it actually closed. Clara unpacked supplies and tried to organize them in a way that made sense. Though with almost no storage space, everything ended up in piles on the floor. They strung rope across the bed frame and laid blankets over it to create something you could sleep on without falling through. By the time they finished, it was full dark outside and Clara was swaying on her feet from exhaustion. 3 days of travel, 2 days of hard riding, and now this. Her body felt like it had been run over by a freight wagon. "You should sleep," Mercer said. "I'll bed down outside with the horses." "You can sleep in here. There's room by the fire." He shook his head. "Not proper. You're an unmarried woman. I'm an unmarried man. People talk." "There's nobody here to talk." "There will be. And reputation matters more in small territories than it did in Philadelphia. You'll need folks to think well of you if you're going to survive." He headed for the door. "I'll be outside if you need anything. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired. "Thank you for helping." Mercer paused in the doorway. "Wasn't doing it for thanks. Just seemed like the right thing." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara alone in her cabin for the first time. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at what was now her home. The fire cast moving shadows on the walls. Wind whistled through gaps in the logs. Somewhere outside, something made a sound that might have been an owl or might have been something more dangerous. Clara lay down fully dressed. She was too tired to bother changing and too cold to risk it anyway, and pulled the blankets up to her chin. The bed was lumpy and smelled like old canvas, and the cabin creaked with every gust of wind, but she was horizontal and that was enough. She thought she'd lie awake worrying about everything she didn't know how to do, but she was asleep before she could finish the thought. Morning came too early, gray light seeping through the shutters. Clara woke to the sound of an axe striking wood in steady rhythm. She dragged herself out of bed. Everything still hurt from riding, but in new and different places now, and stumbled outside. Mercer had already been up for hours by the look of it. He'd felled a dead pine and was working his way through it, cutting it into manageable lengths. His horse and the pack animal were grazing nearby. A coffee pot sat by a small fire built away from the cabin. Clara walked over and poured herself a cup. The coffee was stronger than Thomas's had been, almost thick enough to chew. It burned going down, but woke her up fast. "Morning," Mercer said, not pausing in his work. "There's bacon in the pan if you want it." Clara found the bacon crispy and greasy and perfect, and ate it with her fingers while watching him work. He moved with efficient economy, no wasted motion. Each swing of the axe bit deep into the wood, chips flying. Within an hour, he had enough cut to last Clara a week, maybe more. "You make it look easy," Clara said. "It's not, but doing it wrong is harder." He buried the axe in a stump and wiped sweat off his face despite the morning chill. "Come here. You need to learn this." He showed her how to grip the axe, how to position her feet, how to let the weight of the tool do most of the work. Then he handed it to her and stepped back. "Try it." Clara swung. The axe glanced off the log and nearly took her own foot off. Mercer caught her arm before she could swing again. "Slower. You're fighting it instead of working with it." He adjusted her grip, showed her the motion again. "Like this. Let the axe fall where it wants to fall." She tried again. This time the blade bit into the wood, though not very deep. Her third swing missed entirely and stuck in the ground. "This is humiliating," Clara muttered. "Everyone's bad at first. You'll get better." Mercer pulled the axe free and handed it back. "Keep at it. I'm going to check the property, see what else needs doing." He left her there with the axe and a pile of wood and instructions to practice. Clara spent the next hour making a fool of herself, missing more often than hitting, getting blisters on her palms even through her dress gloves, working up a sweat that made her feel sticky and disgusting. But slowly, grudgingly, she started getting the hang of it. The axe began going where she aimed it more often than not. The pieces of wood started actually splitting instead of just getting dented. By the time Mercer came back, she'd managed to cut one log into firewood-sized chunks and was starting on a second. Her arms trembled from exhaustion, and the blisters had burst and bled into her gloves, but she'd done it. Mercer examined her work without comment, then nodded. "Not bad. You'll have calluses soon, then it'll hurt less." "How reassuring." "Wasn't trying to reassure you." But there was approval in his voice. "The creek's clean and running strong. You'll have good water through winter. Property line runs up to that rocky outcrop north of here. It's marked with cairns if you know where to look. About 40 acres total, most of it wooded. Good for timber, not much for farming. I don't know how to farm anyway. Then good you don't have farmland. Mercer pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, rough and creased with a pencil drawing on it. Made you a map. Shows the boundaries, where the best timber is, the creek, and the trail back to town. Don't lose it. Clara took the map carefully, unexpectedly touched by the gesture. Thank you. Also mark Tom's ranch and my place. I'm about 6 miles east if you follow the creek. If you need help and can't make it to town, come there. You have a ranch? Had one. Mostly just maintaining it now. He didn't elaborate, and his tone suggested he wouldn't appreciate questions. Point is, you're not as isolated as it looks. There's people within reach if things go bad. What kind of bad? Any kind. Injury, sickness, animals, weather, anything that might kill you. Mercer glanced at the sky, reading something in the clouds Clara couldn't interpret. Storm coming, maybe 2 days out. You'll want to get the roof checked before it hits. Missing shingles will let rain in, and rain means rot. Clara looked at the cabin roof. It looked fine to her, but she was learning fast that looking fine and being fine were very different things out here. They spent the rest of the morning working on the cabin. Mercer climbed up and checked the roof, found 3 places where shingles had come loose or broken, and showed Clara how to nail new ones in place using cedar shakes he'd split from a log. She was terrified of falling, but forced herself up the ladder anyway, because Mercer was right. She had to learn this. The view from the roof was spectacular. She could see for miles in every direction, all rolling hills and forest and empty sky. It was beautiful and lonely in equal measure. You'll want to scout your property regular, Mercer said from below. Learn every tree and rock. That way you'll notice if something changes. Tracks you don't recognize, signs of predators, places where the creek's running different. Knowing your land can save your life. Clara climbed down carefully and added scout the property to the growing list of things she needed to do and didn't know how to do properly. They broke for lunch, more bacon, hardtack that had to be soaked in coffee to be edible, and water from the creek that tasted of minerals and pine. Clara sat on a stump and tried not to think about how sore she was, how many blisters she'd earned, how impossibly huge the task of surviving here seemed. You're wondering if you made a mistake, Mercer said. Clara looked at him, startled. How did you know? It's written all over your face, and because it's a reasonable thing to wonder. He tossed coffee grounds into the fire, where they hissed and steamed. You probably did make a mistake. This life kills people. But it was your mistake to make, and that counts for something. Does it? Yeah, better to die free than live safe and miserable. He stood and brushed off his pants. I need to head back before dark. You going to be all right here alone? The question sent a spike of fear through Clara's chest. Alone, truly alone, for the first time in her life. In Philadelphia, she'd always been surrounded by people, too many people, crowding into shared rooms and narrow streets. Even on the train west, there'd been crowds. But here, once Mercer left, it would be just her and the wilderness, and nothing in between. I'll be fine, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Mercer studied her face like he was reading a book. If you're not, my place is 6 miles east. Follow the creek downstream, you can't miss it. Don't be stupid and stubborn if you need help. I thought stubborn was a compliment out here. It is. Stupid isn't. He went to collect his horse. I left extra ammunition for the rifle by the door. You know how to shoot? No. Then learn fast. Wolves, bears, mountain lions. They're all out there, and they're all dangerous. Guns loaded, but the safety's on. Don't touch it unless you need it, but don't hesitate if you do. Clara felt her throat tighten. You're really just leaving me here with wolves and bears and no idea how to protect myself? You're the one who insisted on claiming this land. But Mercer's voice softened slightly. You're tougher than you think. You rode 2 days without complaint, even though I know it hurt like hell. You learned to use an axe in one morning. You'll figure out the rest. He swung up onto his horse and looked down at her, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. For a moment, Clara wanted to beg him to stay, or to take her back to town, or to do anything except leave her alone in this place that could kill her in 100 different ways. But she didn't beg. She just nodded and said, "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're still alive come spring." He turned the horse east. And Clara? It was the first time he'd used her given name. She looked up at him. "Don't give up," he said. "It gets easier." Then he rode off through the trees, and Clara was alone. The silence was overwhelming. Not quiet, there were plenty of sounds, birds and wind and rustling leaves, but the absence of human voices felt like a physical weight. Clara stood in the clearing and tried to adjust to it, this new reality where she was responsible for everything and there was nobody to fall back on if she failed. She went back to work because work was better than thinking. Checked the firewood supply and realized it still wasn't enough. Practiced with the axe until her arms couldn't lift it anymore. Carried water from the creek in the bucket Mercer had left, making trip after trip until she had enough stored inside for cooking and washing. Walked the property boundaries following Mercer's map, trying to memorize landmarks and trails. By evening, she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. This was exhaustion of the soul, the kind that came from being pushed past every limit you thought you had. Clara made a simple dinner of beans and bacon over the fire, ate without tasting it, and sat staring at the flames as darkness closed in around the cabin. Every sound made her jump: the crack of a branch, the call of an owl, the rustle of something moving through underbrush nearby. Back in Philadelphia, darkness meant street lamps and people and the constant hum of city life. Here, darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that pressed against the windows and made you acutely aware of how fragile your walls were, how thin the boundary between safety and everything else. Clara forced herself to check the door. It was barred properly, and the shutters closed tight, before allowing herself to go to bed. She lay there in the dark, listening to her heartbeat and the cabin creaking, and tried not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. Morning came gray and cold, with fog hanging thick in the hollow. Clara dragged herself out of bed, feeling like she'd been beaten. Every muscle ached. Her hands were swollen around the burst blisters. Her face felt tight and hot from sunburn she'd gotten yesterday without noticing. But she was alive. That was something. She rebuilt the fire, made coffee, forced herself to eat even though she wasn't hungry. Then she went outside to continue the endless work of preparing for winter. The days started to blur together, cutting wood, hauling water, learning to cook over an open fire instead of a proper stove. Everything either burned or stayed raw, and Clara wasted precious supplies figuring out the timing. She practiced with the rifle until she could at least hit a tree most of the time, though the recoil bruised her shoulder and the noise made her ears ring. She patched the floor using boards scavenged from the old woodpile, chinked gaps in the walls with moss and mud the way Mercer had instructed, reinforced the door with extra crossbars. Every task took 3 times longer than it should have because she was learning from scratch, making mistakes, having to redo things. On the 4th day, the storm Mercer had predicted rolled in. Clara woke to wind hammering the cabin and rain driving against the walls like thrown gravel. The temperature had dropped dramatically overnight. Her breath steamed in the air inside the cabin despite the fire. She got up and checked for leaks, found 2 places where water was seeping through the roof despite the repairs, and positioned pots underneath to catch the drips. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of relentless wind and rain, of being trapped inside with nothing to do but feed the fire and listen to the weather try to tear her cabin apart. Clara read her poetry book cover to cover twice, thought about her mother, thought about Philadelphia, thought about Thomas and his promises, and wondered if he felt any guilt at all. Mostly she tried not to think about how alone she was. When the storm finally broke, Clara emerged to find the world transformed. Trees down across the clearing, branches scattered everywhere, the creek running high and muddy, twice its normal width. But the cabin had held. Her roof patches had worked. She'd survived her first real test. Clara spent the day clearing debris and checking for damage. That's when she found the problem with the food supplies. Rain had gotten into the storage area despite her best efforts. The flour was damp and starting to mold. Half the dried beans had gotten wet and were ruined. The bacon was fine. It was salt-cured enough to survive, but she'd lost more food than she could afford to lose with winter coming. Clara sat on the floor of her cabin and stared at the ruined supplies and felt the weight of how badly she'd miscalculated everything. She didn't know enough. She wasn't prepared enough. And there was nobody to blame but herself. She allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of despair. Then she stood up, salvaged what she could, and added waterproof the storage area to her list of things to do. A week after the storm, Clara heard horses approaching. She grabbed the rifle without thinking. Mercer's training had at least given her that much, and went to the door. 2 riders were coming up the trail, moving slowly. As they got closer, Clara recognized one of them. Mercer rode into the clearing and dismounted, followed by a woman Clara didn't know. The woman was maybe 40, weather-worn and solid, wearing practical range clothes and carrying herself like someone who knew exactly what she was about. "Clara Whitmore," Mercer said. "This is Sarah Chen. She runs a ranch about 8 miles north. Thought you two should meet." Sarah swung down from her horse and gave Clara a frank assessment. "So you're the mail-order bride Tom Carpenter abandoned." Clara lifted her chin. "I'm the woman homesteading the Walker claim, yes." Something like approval flickered in Sarah's eyes. "Fair enough. Rhett tells me you're out here alone trying to figure out how not to die. That about right?" "More or less." "Then you need help, whether you want to admit it or not." Sarah walked toward the cabin without waiting for an invitation. "Let's see what kind of mess you've gotten yourself into." Clara followed her inside, bristling slightly at the presumption, but also desperately curious. Sarah moved through the cabin with the eye of someone who'd lived this life for decades, noting everything: the patched floor, the chinked walls, the storage area with its ruined supplies. "Not bad for someone who doesn't know what they're doing," Sarah said finally. "You've made mistakes, but they're fixable mistakes. That counts for something." "Thank you, I think." Sarah smiled, the first real warmth Clara had seen from her. "It's a compliment. Most city people would have given up by now, or died." She sat at Clara's wobbly table like she owned the place. "Rhett says you might be stubborn enough to survive. I wanted to see for myself." "And?" "Jury's still out, but you haven't quit yet, which is more than I expected." Sarah pulled a bundle from her coat. "Brought you some supplies. Seeds for next spring, if you make it that long. Sourdough starter, better than trying to make bread with commercial yeast out here. And some spare canning jars. You'll need them if you manage to grow anything." Clara took the bundle, touched by the unexpected kindness. "I don't know how to can food." "Then I'll teach you, or you'll die of starvation. One or the other." Sarah stood. "I'm heading to town day after tomorrow for supplies. You can ride with me if you want. Learn the route, meet some people. Can't homestead completely alone. You'll need neighbors eventually." "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked. "You don't even know me." Sarah and Mercer exchanged a look that Clara couldn't quite read. Then Sarah said, "Because 20 years ago I was a widow with 3 kids trying to hold a ranch together after my husband died. People helped me when they didn't have to, and I survived because of it. Now I help other women who need it. Simple as that." She walked back to her horse and mounted up. "Day after tomorrow, dawn. I'll stop here on my way past. Be ready to ride." They left before Clara could figure out what to say. She stood in the clearing holding the bundle of supplies and feeling something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe. Or at least the possibility that she might not have to do this completely alone. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Clara practiced riding the mare until her thighs stopped screaming quite so loudly. Organized her remaining supplies. Made a list of things she needed from town: more flour, salt, nails, oilcloth for the storage area. When Sarah arrived at dawn on the appointed day, Clara was waiting, saddled and ready. They rode together through the morning, Sarah setting a steady pace and pointing out landmarks. "That lightning-struck pine marks the eastern boundary of my property. The red rock formation there is where the trail splits. Left goes to my ranch, right continues to town. Creek's reliable year-round, but freezes solid come January. You'll need to chop through the ice for water." Clara absorbed everything, trying to memorize routes and markers. Having a guide made the territory feel less hostile, more navigable. "You know Rhett Long?" Sarah asked after a while. "Just met him when I arrived. He was doing a favor for Thomas Carpenter." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Rhett's a good man. Doesn't let many people close, but when he helps someone, he means it." "He's been kind," Clara said carefully. "He's been more than kind. Checking on you, asking me to look in on you, making sure you don't die of ignorance." Sarah gave her a sideways look. "Don't waste that." Clara wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing. They reached town around noon. The settlement looked different in daylight, without desperation clouding Clara's vision. Still small and rough, but busy with activity. Wagons hauling freight, women shopping at the general store, children running loose in the street. It felt almost welcoming after 2 weeks of isolation. Sarah introduced Clara to people as they went. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the bakery. The blacksmith, whose name Clara immediately forgot. A rancher named Morrison, who looked at Clara with open skepticism, but nodded politely enough. Mr. Hendricks at the general store greeted her like an old customer. "Heard you took the Walker claim," he said, tallying up her purchases. "That's bold for a woman alone." "Apparently I'm bold or stupid," Clara said. "I haven't decided which." Hendricks laughed. "Out here, they're usually the same thing. You need credit, let me know. I extend it to homesteaders who look like they might survive." Clara thanked him and paid cash, wanting to preserve her independence as long as she could. She left the store with her supplies and a strange feeling that maybe, possibly, she was starting to belong here. Sarah bought her lunch at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson served them with tight-lipped disapproval, but didn't refuse the business. And they spent an hour talking about winter preparation, what Clara needed to do, what mistakes to avoid. "Biggest killer is isolation," Sarah said. "Not the cold or the wolves or the work. It's being alone so long you start to lose your grip on things. You need to get to town regular, see people, remember you're human." "How regular?" "Once a month minimum, more if you can manage it." Sarah mopped up stew with bread. "And if the snow gets too deep, come stay at my place. I've got room and I'd rather have company than hear you froze to death alone in that cabin." Clara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just stay alive." Sarah stood and dropped coins on the table. "Ready to head back?" They rode out of town in the afternoon, supplies tied secure behind their saddles. Clara felt better than she had since arriving in Wyoming. She had friends now, maybe not close friends yet, but people who cared whether she lived or died. That was more than she'd had a month ago. They parted ways at the split in the trail, Sarah heading north toward her ranch, and Clara continuing west toward home. Home. The word felt strange applied to that tiny cabin in the wilderness, but it was starting to fit. Clara rode the last miles alone as sunset painted the sky and thought about everything she'd learned: how to swing an axe, how to patch a roof, how to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, how to keep going when everything hurt and nothing was certain. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off that train crying over broken promises. That woman had been soft and naive and dependent on others. This woman was developing calluses and learning hard skills and starting to understand that survival wasn't about comfort. It was about showing up every day and doing what needed to be done, whether you wanted to or not. Clara reached her cabin as the last light faded from the sky. She unsaddled the mare, fed her the grain she'd bought in town, and checked the cabin for problems. Everything was as she'd left it. Her woodpile was still there. Her water bucket was still full. The fire she'd banked before leaving still had coals she could revive. She rebuilt the fire, made dinner, ate alone in the firelight. Outside, wolves howled in the distance. Clara listened to them without fear, just acceptance. They were part of the landscape now, same as the trees and rocks and endless sky. Tomorrow she'd waterproof the storage area, fix that wobbly table leg, scout the north boundary for good timber. 100 tasks waiting, always more work than time. But tonight, Clara allowed herself to sit by the fire and feel something that might have been pride. She'd survived 2 weeks. She'd made allies. She'd learned skills she didn't know existed a month ago. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And somewhere out there in the darkness, 6 miles east, Rhett Mercer was probably checking his own cabin and hoping she was still alive. The thought made her smile despite everything. Clara banked the fire, barred the door, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new chances to fail or succeed. She'd take them as they came. October arrived with frost on the ground and ice at the edges of the creek. Clara woke one morning to find her breath visible inside the cabin despite the fire she'd kept burning all night. Winter was coming faster than she'd expected, and she wasn't ready. She spent the morning hauling more wood, her hands so cold they could barely grip the axe. The pile beside her cabin was growing, but Sarah had warned her she'd need 3 times what looked sufficient. Every tree she felled felt like a small victory and a reminder of how much more there was to do. Around noon, she heard horses again. This time it was Mercer, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He rode into the clearing, and Clara felt something lift in her chest at the sight of him, though she told herself it was just relief at seeing another human face after days alone. "Brought you some things," he said without preamble, dismounting. "Extra blankets, more ammunition, and some lumber scraps from my place. Figured you could use them for repairs." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He started unloading the mule. But winter up here kills unprepared people, and I'd rather not find your frozen corpse come spring." How romantic. That almost smile flickered across his scarred face. Never claimed to be romantic, just practical. Clara helped him carry things inside. The extra blankets were thick wool, worn but clean. The lumber was good quality, cut to useful sizes. It was more help than she'd expected and more than she could easily repay. "What do I owe you?" she asked. "Nothing. Call it neighborly." "Neighbors 6 miles apart isn't very neighborly." "It is out here." Mercer looked around the cabin, taking inventory the way he always did. His gaze stopped on the water bucket, which was only half full. "You having trouble with the creek?" "It's starting to freeze at the edges. Takes longer to fill the bucket." "Show me." They walked down to the creek together. The water was running clear and cold, but ice had formed along both banks, narrowing the channel. Mercer studied it for a moment, then pointed upstream. "There's a deeper pool about 50 yards that way. Won't freeze as fast. You should take water from there instead." Clara followed him to the pool, a place where the creek curved and deepened, protected by overhanging rocks. The water here moved slower but ran deeper, and she could see he was right about it being less likely to freeze solid. "I didn't know this was here," she admitted. "You haven't explored your property enough. You should know every water source, every shelter, every game trail. Your life might depend on it." Mercer's tone was matter-of-fact, not critical. Winter's not forgiving of ignorance. "I'm starting to understand that." They walked back to the cabin, and Mercer spent the afternoon teaching her things he said she should have already learned. How to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. How to tell if a tree was dead enough to cut safely or would come down on top of her. How to set snares for rabbits and other small game, because her ammunition wouldn't last forever and she needed meat. "Hunting's not just about shooting straight," he explained, crouched beside a game trail, showing her how to position a snare. "It's about understanding where animals go and why. This trail leads from cover to water. Rabbits use it regular. Set your snare here. Check it morning and evening." Clara watched his scarred hands work the wire with practiced efficiency. "Where did you learn all this?" "Army. Spent 6 years as a scout in the cavalry before I mustered out." He didn't elaborate, and something in his voice suggested she shouldn't ask. "Point is, these skills keep you alive. You need to learn them." "I'm trying." "Try harder. Winter's maybe 6 weeks out, and when it comes hard." He stood and brushed dirt off his knees. "Snow here can get 3 feet deep. 4 in a bad year. You'll be trapped in this cabin for days at a time, maybe weeks. If you're not prepared, you die. It's that simple." Clara felt the weight of that sink in. She'd been so focused on day-to-day survival, she hadn't really thought about what deep winter would mean. Total isolation. No way to get to town or even to Sarah's ranch. Just her in the cabin and whatever supplies she'd managed to stockpile. "I'll need more food," she said, calculating, "and more wood. And probably more things I haven't thought of yet." "Yeah, you will." Mercer headed back toward his horse. "I'll come by when I can, help with the heavy work. But you need to be able to survive on your own. Can't always count on someone showing up." "I understand." He swung into the saddle and looked down at her, backlit by the afternoon sun. For a moment, Clara saw past the scars and the hard edges to something else. Concern, maybe, or respect. It was gone too fast to be sure. "You're doing better than I expected," he said. "Don't let that make you careless." Then he rode off, leaving Clara alone with a pile of new supplies and a deeper understanding of how much danger she was actually in. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Clara worked from before dawn until after dark, pushing herself past exhaustion every day. She cut wood until her shoulders screamed and her blistered hands bled through the calluses that had finally formed. She hauled water and dried meat and learned to make pemmican from Sarah's recipe, a disgusting mixture of fat and dried berries and shredded meat that tasted terrible but would keep all winter and provided enough energy to survive on. She checked her snares twice daily and learned to skin rabbits, a messy process that made her gag the first few times but became routine. The meat was lean and gamey, but it was protein and she needed it. She smoked what she couldn't eat right away, filling the cabin with a haze that made her eyes water but preserved food for the months ahead. Sarah came by twice more, each time bringing supplies Clara hadn't known she needed. Salt for curing meat, extra rope, a slab of bacon that must have cost a fortune but Sarah waved off payment for. You can pay me back in spring, Sarah said, if you survive. You're very encouraging. I'm very realistic. Sarah helped Clara organize her supplies, showing her how to rotate stock and protect things from mice and moisture. Most homesteaders fail in the first year, not because they're weak, but because they don't take winter seriously. I'm making sure you take it seriously. I'm terrified. Does that count? It's a start. Sarah looked around the cabin with an appraising eye. You've done good work here. Place looks livable, but you're going to go crazy cooped up all winter with nothing to do. I'll have plenty to do. Surviving, mostly. I mean mentally. You need projects. Things to work on during the long nights when you can't go outside. Sarah pulled a bundle from her saddlebag. Brought you some fabric scraps and thread. You can make quilts, clothes, whatever. Keeps your hands busy and your mind occupied. Clara took the bundle, touched by the thoughtfulness. Thank you. Also brought this. Sarah produced a battered book. Poetry. Figured you might like it based on what Rhett said. Clara felt her throat tighten. Rhett told you I like poetry? He mentioned you had a book you read a lot. Thought you might want another one. Sarah's eyes were kind. He worries about you, even if he won't admit it. After Sarah left, Clara sat by the fire holding the poetry book and feeling something complicated twist in her chest. Mercer had noticed what she read, had cared enough to mention it to Sarah, had made sure she'd have something to read through the winter. She opened the book to a random page and read by firelight until her eyes grew heavy. The first snow came in early November, just a dusting that melted by noon, but it was a warning of what was coming. Clara doubled her efforts, working even harder to finish preparations before the serious storms hit. She was hauling wood one morning when she heard shouting in the distance. Clara dropped the logs and grabbed the rifle, her heart hammering. The shouts were coming from the north, multiple voices, men yelling. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was angry. She'd just started toward the sound when 3 riders burst through the trees into her clearing. Clara raised the rifle on instinct, and the riders pulled up short. They were rough-looking men, weathered and hard, wearing clothes that had seen better days. One of them laughed when he saw her. Well, look at this. The mail-order bride playing homesteader. Clara kept the rifle steady even though her hands wanted to shake. This is private property. You need to leave. We're just passing through, sweetheart. No need to get hostile. The man who'd spoken, he seemed to be the leader, nudged his horse a few steps closer. Name's Dalton. Heard about you in town. City girl trying to survive on her own. That's ambitious. It's none of your business. Clara didn't lower the gun. Turn around and keep riding. Not very neighborly. Dalton's smile didn't reach his eyes. We're looking for strays that wandered off from Tom Carpenter's herd. You seen any cattle? No. Mind if we look around, make sure they didn't wander onto your property? Yes, I mind. Leave, now. The other 2 men exchanged looks. One of them said, Dalton, maybe we should... Shut up. Dalton's smile disappeared. Now listen, girl. We got a job to do, and some city woman with a rifle she probably can't even shoot isn't going to stop us. So why don't you put that down before someone gets hurt? Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. She had no idea if she could actually shoot a man, but she wasn't about to let them know that. Get off my property. Or what? You'll shoot all 3 of us? Dalton laughed. Even if you could, which I doubt, that'd make you a murderer. A lot of trouble for a woman alone. He was right, and they both knew it. Clara's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. She couldn't shoot them without cause, couldn't run. They'd just chase her down, couldn't... A gunshot cracked across the clearing. Everyone froze. Then a voice called out from the tree line. The lady asked you to leave. I suggest you listen. Mercer rode into the clearing, rifle in hand, positioned so he had a clear line on all 3 men. His face was cold and hard, the expression of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Dalton's smile returned, but it was strained. Mercer, didn't know you were playing protector. Didn't know you were playing bandit. Carpenter send you? We're looking for his cattle, legitimate business. Then you can look on his property, not hers. Mercer's rifle didn't waver. Clara, they give you any trouble before I got here? They threatened me, Clara said, relieved and furious in equal measure. Told me to put down my gun. That's a problem. Mercer's voice went flat. Dalton, you and your boys are going to turn those horses around and ride back the way you came. If I see you on Miss Whitmore's property again, I'll assume you're trespassing with ill intent. You know what happens then. You can't guard her every minute. Don't need to guard her every minute. Just need to make sure you know she's under my protection. Mercer moved his horse closer, still covering all three men. We clear? Dalton stared at him for a long moment, then spat on the ground. Clear. The three men turned and rode off, disappearing into the trees. Clara lowered the rifle, her arms shaking now that the threat was gone. She felt like she might throw up. Mercer dismounted and took the rifle gently from her hands. You all right? I don't know. Clara's voice came out unsteady. I thought they were going to... I don't know what they were going to do. Nothing good. Mercer checked the rifle, making sure the safety was on, then leaned it against the cabin wall. Dalton's a hired hand for carpenter, probably was looking for strays, but men like that see opportunity when they find a woman alone. You did right, standing your ground. I was terrified. Being scared doesn't mean you failed. You held that rifle steady and didn't back down. That takes courage. He studied her face. But you can't live out here alone anymore, not with men like Dalton knowing you're here. Clara's stomach dropped. You're saying I have to leave. I'm saying you need better protection. Mercer was quiet for a moment, clearly working through something in his head. My place has extra room. You could move there for the winter. Keep your claim. Come back in spring. Nobody would think less of you. Everyone would think less of me. Single woman living with a single man. Clara shook her head. I'd be ruined. Might as well marry Thomas Carpenter at that point. Then marry me. The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Clara stared at Mercer, certain she'd misheard. What? Marry me. Mercer's face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. It's practical. You need protection and security. I've got both. Nobody would question a wife living at her husband's ranch. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Mercer met her eyes steadily. I'm not offering romance or love. I'm offering a solution to a problem. You need help surviving winter. I can provide that. In return, you'd help with the ranch work, cooking, maintaining the house, the kind of things I'm not good at. It's a fair trade. Clara felt like the ground had shifted under her feet. This was the second marriage proposal she'd received in Wyoming, and somehow this one was even more shocking than Thomas's letters had been. At least Thomas had pretended affection. Mercer was proposing a business arrangement, cold and practical. I don't need saving, she said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. Didn't say you did. But you do need help, whether you admit it or not. And He paused, choosing words carefully. I could use someone around. Place gets quiet living alone. You want a wife because you're lonely? I want a partner because it's practical. Two people survive better than one out here, you know that. Mercer's voice was level, reasonable. Think about it. You don't have to answer now. Yes, I do. Clara surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. No, thank you for the offer, but no. I came out here to be independent, not to trade one marriage of convenience for another. Something flickered in Mercer's expression. Disappointment, maybe, or respect. All right, but the offer stands if you change your mind. I won't. We'll see. He collected his horse's reins. I'll ride by regular, make sure Dalton and his friends don't come back. And Clara? What? Keep that rifle loaded. Don't hesitate to use it if you need to. He rode off, leaving Clara standing in her clearing with her heart pounding and her thoughts in chaos. A marriage proposal. From Mercer. She hadn't seen that coming. She went back to hauling wood, trying to work off the adrenaline and confusion, but her mind kept circling back to it. He'd been serious, completely serious. And part of her, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, had been tempted to say yes. But she'd meant what she said. She'd come too far and worked too hard to give up her independence now. She'd survive winter on her own or she'd die trying. The temperature dropped steadily over the next week. Clara woke each morning to thicker ice on the creek, harder ground, colder air. Her breath steamed constantly now. Her fingers went numb handling firewood even with gloves on. She was checking her snares one morning, empty again, the rabbit seemed to have figured out her pattern, when she heard something moving in the trees. Clara froze, listening. Whatever it was big. Too big to be a deer. She thought of Mercer's warnings about bears and felt her pulse spike. The sound came closer. Branches cracking, something breathing heavy. Then a cow stumbled out of the underbrush into the clearing. Clara stared at it. The animal was gaunt and exhausted, ice crusted in its fur, one of its legs bleeding from a deep cut. It saw Clara and made a low, miserable sound. She approached carefully. The cow wore a brand, TC, Thomas Carpenter's cattle. This must be one of the strays Dalton and his men had been looking for. The cow was in bad shape. Besides the leg wound, it looked half-starved and was shivering despite its thick winter coat. Left alone, it would probably die within days. Clara thought about Dalton's threats, thought about Thomas Carpenter and his broken promises, thought about how much easier it would be to just chase the cow off her property and let it be someone else's problem. Then she thought about the kind of person she wanted to be and sighed. She spent the rest of the day coaxing the injured cow into her small corral, which meant first repairing the corral because it had half collapsed over the summer. She cleaned and bandaged the leg wound using strips torn from one of her spare shirts. She gave the cow hay she'd been saving for her horse and water from her precious supply. The animal could barely stand, but it drank and ate, and by evening looked slightly less likely to die immediately. Clara went to bed exhausted and frustrated, knowing she'd just made her own winter harder to feed an animal that didn't even belong to her. The next morning, she saddled her mare and rode toward Thomas Carpenter's ranch. She needed to let him know she had his cow, even though the thought of seeing him again made her jaw clench. She found Thomas outside his barn, working on a wagon wheel. He looked up as she rode in, and his face went carefully blank. "Clara, what brings you here?" "One of your cows wandered onto my property. Injured leg, half-starved. I patched her up, but she needs proper care." Thomas straightened, surprise flickering across his features. "You helped her? Was I supposed to let her die?" "Most people would have, or sent word and made me come get her." He wiped his hands on his pants. "Dalton said they checked your place, said you ran them off." "Dalton and his friends threatened me. Rhett Mercer showed up before it got worse." Clara kept her voice level. "They were using the search as an excuse to harass me." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to them." "You should fire them. They're dangerous." "I need the help. Good ranch hands are hard to find." But he looked uncomfortable, like he knew he was making excuses. "About the cow, I'll send someone to collect her, and I'll pay you for the feed and care. I don't want your money, just keep your men off my property." "Fair enough." Thomas hesitated. "How are you doing? Out there alone?" "I'm surviving." "Clara, if you need—" "I don't need anything from you, Thomas. I'm managing fine on my own." Clara turned her horse. "Someone will come for the cow?" "Tomorrow. I'll make sure of it." Clara rode back to her cabin, anger simmering under her skin. Thomas had seemed almost concerned, almost guilty, but not enough to actually do anything about Dalton, not enough to take real responsibility. She spent the afternoon tending the injured cow and trying not to think about how complicated everything had become. 3 months ago, she'd been working in a Philadelphia factory. Now she was patching up cattle on a Wyoming homestead, turning down marriage proposals, and learning to survive in a place that actively tried to kill people. Her life had become unrecognizable. True to Thomas's word, someone came for the cow the next day. Not Dalton, thankfully, but an older ranch hand who thanked Clara politely and led the animal away without incident. He left behind a bag of oats as payment, which Clara accepted because she needed the feed more than she needed pride. That night, the first real snow arrived. Clara woke to silence, the particular heavy silence that meant serious snowfall. She opened the shutters and found the world transformed. 6 inches of snow covered everything, turning the clearing into something strange and beautiful. More was falling steadily, big flakes drifting down in the windless dawn. She built up the fire and made coffee, then stood at the window watching the snow accumulate. This was it. Winter had arrived. Everything she'd been preparing for, all the warnings, were now reality. By noon, there was a foot of snow. By evening, 18 inches. It snowed for 3 days straight, and when it finally stopped, Clara's clearing was buried under 2 feet of white. She spent a day digging out, clearing a path to the corral, to the woodpile, to the creek where she had to chop through 3 inches of ice to get water. Her entire body ached from the effort. Her lungs burned in the cold air. But she did it because the alternative was staying trapped inside, watching her supplies dwindle. The snow changed everything. Simple tasks became exhausting. Walking 50 feet required wading through knee-deep drifts. The cold was relentless, seeping through walls and blankets and every layer she wore. The world shrank to just her cabin and the small area around it she could realistically reach. Clara had thought she understood isolation before. She'd been wrong. This was true isolation. Days passed where the only living things she saw were her horse and the occasional bird. No human voices, no conversation, just the wind and the snow and her own thoughts. She tried to stay busy. She sewed using Sarah's fabric scraps, making patches for her worn clothes and a warmer blanket. She read her poetry books over and over until she had favorite passages memorized. She practiced the rifle inside the cabin, dry firing at targets to keep her skills sharp without wasting ammunition. But the nights were the worst, long and dark, and so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She'd lie awake thinking about Philadelphia, about her mother, about all the choices that had led her to this frozen cabin in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes she cried, silently, into her blankets where nobody could hear. 2 weeks into the snow, she heard horses again. Clara grabbed the rifle, it was always loaded now, and went to the door. Through the window she could see 2 figures on horseback, moving slowly through the deep snow. Mercer and Sarah. Clara threw open the door, relief flooding through her so strongly it made her dizzy. They were the first people she'd seen in 2 weeks, and she hadn't realized how desperately she needed human contact until that moment. "We brought supplies," Sarah called out, dismounting. "Figured you might be running low." They'd brought flour, coffee, dried meat, and most precious of all, news from the outside world. Clara made them coffee, and they sat around her fire while Sarah told stories about town, who'd married who, what fights had broken out, which ranchers were struggling with the early snow. Mercer was quieter, but his eyes moved constantly around the cabin, checking on things. He noticed the new patches in her clothes, the way she'd organized her supplies, the rifle kept within reach. When Sarah went outside to check on the horses, he said quietly, "You're doing well." "I'm going crazy." "That's normal. Winter does that." He poured more coffee. "Offer still stands, you know. My place." "I'm not marrying you for convenience, Rhett." "Didn't ask you to marry me for convenience. Asked you to marry me because it makes sense." He met her eyes. "But I respect your answer. Just know the door's open if you change your mind." Sarah came back in, stamping snow off her boots. "Storm's coming. We need to head out before it hits." They left shortly after, Sarah hugging Clara tight and making her promise to come to her ranch if things got desperate. Mercer just nodded, but there was something in his expression Clara couldn't quite read. After they left, the cabin felt emptier than before. But the supplies they'd brought would keep her fed for another month at least. And the company, brief as it was, had reminded her that she wasn't completely alone. The storm Sarah had predicted arrived that night, worse than the first one. It screamed through the valley for 4 days, dumping snow until Clara couldn't see her corral from the cabin window. She was trapped inside, burning through her carefully rationed firewood faster than she'd planned, because the temperature dropped so low that even with the fire roaring, ice formed on the inside of the shutters. On the 3rd day of the storm, Clara's food supplies ran lower than she'd calculated. She'd been too generous with portions, not accounting for how much energy it took just to stay warm. She started rationing more strictly, but doing the math made her stomach clench. She had maybe 6 weeks of food left if she was careful. But winter had barely started. There were at least 3 more months of snow ahead, probably 4. She was going to run out. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon enough that it mattered. Clara sat by the fire and forced herself to think clearly through the fear. She had options. She could try to make it to Sarah's ranch, 6 miles through deep snow. Probably impossible, but maybe not. She could try to hunt, though game was scarce in winter and she wasn't good enough with the rifle to count on it. She could accept Mercer's offer and move to his place where he had more supplies. Or she could ration harder, hope for an early spring, and gamble with her life. Clara closed her eyes and thought about the woman she'd been on that train platform, desperate and afraid and dependent on a man's promises. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, harder, more capable, but still learning. She'd figure it out. She always did. The storm finally broke on the 5th day. Clara dug herself out and surveyed the damage. 3 feet of new snow, 2 trees down near the property line, her woodpile mostly buried. But the cabin still stood. She was still alive, and that was something. She spent the day digging out again, checking snares, chopping through thick ice at the creek. Exhausting work that left her trembling from cold and effort, but necessary work, survival work. As the sun set, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold, Clara stood outside her cabin and looked at what she'd built. It wasn't much. A tiny cabin in the wilderness, barely adequate shelter, a life measured in harsh terms of simple survival. But it was hers, and she'd be damned if she let winter take it from her. December came with temperatures so cold that Clara's eyelashes froze when she went outside. Her food supplies continued to dwindle despite her strict rationing. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her clothes hanging looser every week. But she kept going because the alternative was admitting defeat, and she'd come too far for that. Christmas passed without acknowledgement. Clara had no way to mark it except noting the date on the calendar she'd scratched into the cabin wall. Just another day of survival, same as all the others. Then on a morning in early January, she woke to find her fire had gone out during the night. The cabin was freezing, colder than she'd ever felt it. Clara's breath came out in white clouds as she stumbled to the fireplace, her fingers so stiff she could barely grip the matches. She tried to light the kindling, but her hands shook too badly. The first match went out, the second, the third. On the fourth try, the kindling caught. Clara fed it carefully, nursing the flame until it grew strong enough to add larger pieces of wood. Slowly, painfully, warmth began to return to the cabin. But Clara understood how close she'd come. If the fire had stayed out much longer, she would have frozen to death in her sleep. The margin between survival and death out here was that thin. She was boiling water for coffee when she heard shouting outside. Clara grabbed the rifle and went to the door, her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see multiple figures in the distance, moving through the snow. Not coming toward her cabin, heading north, toward Sarah's ranch. Something was wrong. Clara dressed in every layer she owned, loaded the rifle, and waded out into the snow. It was waist-deep in places, exhausting to move through. But the shouting continued, urgent and frightened, and she forced herself toward it. She found them gathered at the edge of her property. Sarah, Mercer, 3 men from town, and Thomas Carpenter. They were arguing about something Clara couldn't quite make out. "What's happening?" Clara called out. They turned toward her. Sarah looked relieved. "Thank goodness you're alive. We've been checking on everyone. Storm that hit 3 days ago buried the Morrison place, killed 2 of their ranch hands before they could dig out. We're trying to reach the Fletcher family up in the high valley, but the snow's too deep. Their cabins cut off completely." "How many people up there?" Clara asked. 4. Parents and 2 young kids. Mercer's face was grim. "They'll run out of food before spring if they haven't already. But there's no way through. We've tried twice and had to turn back." Thomas said, "We need to wait until the snow melts enough to make a path. It's the only option." "They could be dead by then," Sarah snapped. "Those kids—" "I know." Thomas looked genuinely distressed. "But we can't help them if we die trying to reach them. The drifts are 12 feet deep in places. Horses can't get through, and people on foot would freeze before making it halfway." Clara looked at the terrain, thinking hard. What about snowshoes and sleds to carry supplies? The men exchanged glances. One of them, Morrison, the rancher Clara had met in town, said, "We don't have snowshoes. Nobody thought to make any." "Then we make them now." Clara's voice was steady, despite the fear crawling up her spine. "We can't leave a family to starve. If there's a way to reach them, we find it." "Miss Whitmore," Thomas started. "She's right," Mercer interrupted. "We can make snowshoes. Take maybe a day if we all work on it. Sleds, too. Load them with food and medicine. Send a team through on foot." "That's suicide," Morrison said flatly. "It's 15 miles through the worst terrain in the valley. In this cold, nobody would make it." "Somebody has to try." Sarah's jaw was set in a way Clara recognized. She'd made up her mind and wouldn't be moved. "I'll go. I know that trail better than anyone." "You'll die," Thomas said. "Sarah, be realistic." "I am being realistic. A family's going to die if we don't help them." Sarah looked at each of them in turn. "I'm going. Anyone who wants to help can join me. Anyone who doesn't can get out of my way." Clara heard herself say, "I'll go with you." Every head turned toward her. Mercer's expression darkened. "No." "Yes." Clara met his eyes. "You need people who can move through snow, carry supplies, and not give up when it gets hard. I've been doing nothing but that for 3 months. I'm going." "You'll freeze to death," Mercer said bluntly. Maybe, but at least I'll die trying to help people instead of sitting safe while children starve. Clara turned to Sarah. What do we need? Over the next several hours, they worked with frantic purpose. Mercer and Thomas built snowshoes from bent willow branches and rawhide cord. Clara and Sarah packed supplies onto makeshift sleds: food, blankets, medicine, firewood. Morrison and his men went to gather more volunteers from nearby ranches. By afternoon, they had a plan. 6 people would make the journey: Sarah, Clara, Mercer, Thomas, and 2 experienced trappers from town who knew winter survival. They'd travel light and fast, reach the Fletcher cabin, deliver supplies, and return before another storm could trap them all. It was dangerous, bordering on insane. Everyone knew it, but nobody suggested abandoning the Fletchers either. They left at dawn the next morning, each person wearing snowshoes and pulling a supply sled. The snowshoes worked, awkward at first, but they kept them from sinking into the deep drifts. Still, progress was brutally slow. Every step required effort. The cold was vicious, the kind that turned exposed skin white with frostbite in minutes. Clara walked between Sarah and Mercer, matching their pace, refusing to be the weak link. Her lungs burned from breathing frozen air. Her legs screamed from the unnatural gait the snowshoes required. But she kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she'd already survived too much to die now. Around noon, they stopped to rest and eat. Thomas passed around jerky and hardtack while Sarah checked everyone for frostbite. Mercer pulled Clara aside. You should turn back, he said quietly, before it's too late. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose. You're exhausted. If this gets worse, then I'll handle it. Clara cut him off. I'm not turning back, Rhett. Stop asking. He studied her face for a long moment. Then he pulled off his extra scarf and wrapped it around her neck. Keep your face covered and stay close to me. They pushed on through the afternoon. The terrain grew rougher, steep hillsides and narrow valleys where the snow had drifted even deeper. Twice they had to backtrack and find alternate routes. Once, Thomas broke through what turned out to be a snow-covered creek and nearly went under before Mercer hauled him out, both men soaked and shaking. They made camp that night in the lee of a rock outcrop, building a fire and huddling close for warmth. Clara had never been so cold in her life. Even with the fire, even wrapped in every blanket they'd brought, the cold seeped into her bones until she couldn't stop shaking. Mercer sat beside her, close enough that she could feel heat radiating from him. This is what I meant, he said quietly. About winter killing people. About needing help to survive. I know. Clara's teeth chattered. But those children needed help more than I need pride. It's not about pride. It's about survival. Maybe survival isn't enough. Clara looked at him through the firelight. Maybe there has to be something more. Or what's the point? Mercer didn't answer, but he moved closer, sharing body heat without making a show of it. They reached the Fletcher cabin late the next afternoon, exhausted and half frozen. The cabin was barely visible, buried under snowdrifts that had piled up against the walls. No smoke came from the chimney. Sarah pounded on the door. Fletcher, it's Sarah Chen. We brought supplies. Nothing. Then slowly, the door cracked open. A woman's face appeared, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Mrs. Fletcher stared at them like they were hallucinations. You're real, she whispered. You're actually real. They got inside and found the situation worse than expected. The family had been out of food for 3 days, burning furniture to stay warm because their firewood had run out a week ago. The children, a boy maybe 6 and a girl around 4, were frighteningly quiet, too weak to even cry. Sarah and Clara immediately went to work. They built up the fire with the wood they'd brought, made hot broth from their supplies, and carefully fed the children small amounts at a time. Too much too fast could make them sick. Thomas and Mercer cleared snow away from the cabin and chopped more firewood from nearby deadfalls. The trappers checked the family for frostbite and other injuries. Mr. Fletcher sat in the corner, his face buried in his hands. I tried, he said, his voice breaking. I tried so hard, but the storms just kept coming and the food ran out, and I couldn't let them die. They're not going to die, Sarah said firmly. We brought enough supplies to get you through until spring, and we'll send more when we can. But getting the supplies there was only half the problem. Getting back out was the other half, and night was falling fast. The temperature was dropping. Another storm was building on the horizon. Clara could see the clouds massing in the west, dark and heavy. "We need to leave now if we're going to beat that storm," one of the trappers said, looking worried. 3 hours, maybe 4 before it hits." "We can't make it back in 4 hours," Thomas said. "We barely made it here in 2 days. Then we stay here and wait it out," Mercer said. "There's not enough room, not enough supplies for everyone." The trapper shook his head. "Some of us need to go back, get help organized in case things get worse." They argued about it while Clara watched the children eat. The little girl had fallen asleep with a piece of hardtack still clutched in her small hand. The boy was staring at the fire like he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Clara thought about Philadelphia, about the factory and the boarding house, and the life she'd left behind. She thought about Thomas's broken promises, and Mercer's practical proposal, and Sarah's stubborn kindness. She thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become, and the distance between them measured in more than miles. "I'll stay," she heard herself say. Everyone turned to look at her. "I'll stay with the Fletchers," Clara continued. "Someone needs to be here to help them, and I know how to ration supplies, keep a fire going, manage a household. The rest of you can go back, send more help when the weather clears." "Absolutely not," Mercer said. "You're coming back with us." "Why? I'm the most expendable person here. Sarah's needed at her ranch. You men have property and responsibilities. I have a cabin that'll still be standing whether I'm there or not." Clara stood up, facing them all. "This is the smart choice and you know it." "It's suicide," Thomas said. "If another storm hits and we can't get back through, then I'll manage. I have been managing for months now." Clara's voice was steady. "Those children need someone who can help them recover. I can do that. So I'm staying." Sarah looked at her with something like pride. "You've got courage, Clara Whitmore." "I've got stubbornness. There's a difference." But Clara smiled slightly. "Go. Get back before the storm hits. I'll be fine here." They argued more, but Clara wouldn't budge. Finally, grudgingly, they agreed. Mercer was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway, snow already starting to fall, and looked at Clara like he wanted to say something important but couldn't find the words. "Don't die," he said finally. "I'll try not to." Clara met his eyes. "Thank you for everything." "Thank me by staying alive." He hesitated, then added, "The offer still stands. My place, when you get back." "I know it does." He left before she could say anything else, and Clara was alone with the Fletcher family and the approaching storm. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Clara's life. She worked around the clock keeping the family alive, rationing food, maintaining the fire, nursing the children back to health, helping Mr. Fletcher repair damage to the cabin. 2 more storms hit in that time, each one worse than the last. Snow piled so high against the walls that Clara had to dig tunnels to reach the woodpile. But slowly, gradually, the family recovered. The children's color returned. They started playing again, their voices filling the cabin with sound Clara hadn't realized she'd been starving for. Mrs. Fletcher began cooking again, and Mr. Fletcher went back to maintaining their property with something like hope in his eyes. "You saved our lives," Mrs. Fletcher said one evening as they prepared dinner together. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me." Clara stirred the pot of stew, adding precious salt from their supplies. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have." Mrs. Fletcher's voice was firm. "Most people would have written us off as a lost cause. You came through hell to help strangers. That's not nothing." Clara thought about that later, lying in her borrowed bedroll by the fire. She'd spent months being angry at Thomas for his broken promises, angry at herself for being naive enough to believe them. But maybe the point wasn't whether you got what you were promised. Maybe the point was what you did when everything fell apart. 3 weeks after Clara had stayed behind, the weather finally broke long enough for rescue to arrive. Sarah came with 2 wagons, Mercer, and 6 men from town. They brought more supplies, medicine, and news that winter was finally starting to loosen its grip. Clara walked out into the sunshine, real sunshine, weak but warm, and felt tears freeze on her cheeks. "You're alive," Sarah said, pulling her into a fierce hug. "You stubborn, crazy, wonderful woman. You're alive." Mercer said nothing, but the relief in his face said everything. They loaded the Fletcher family into one of the wagons. They'd come stay in town until spring made their cabin more accessible. Clara climbed into the second wagon, exhausted down to her bones, but also strangely at peace. The journey back took 2 days. When they finally reached Clara's cabin, she almost cried at the sight of it. Her tiny, inadequate, beautiful cabin, still standing, still hers. Mercer helped her down from the wagon. Your place held up well. I checked on it when I could. Thank you. Clara. He said her name like it cost him something. I meant what I said about my offer. Clara looked at him, this hard, scarred man who'd helped her when he didn't have to, who'd taught her to survive, who'd checked on her cabin while she was gone. She thought about his practical proposal and her angry refusal, about independence and survival, and what it actually meant to build a life. Can I see your ranch? She asked. Before I answer? Something like hope flickered in his eyes. Now? Why not? They rode together through the melting snow to Mercer's place. It was bigger than Clara had expected, a solid cabin with multiple rooms, a large barn, good pasture land. Evidence of work and care everywhere she looked. Not fancy, but real and permanent in a way her own cabin wasn't yet. It's a good place, Clara said. It could be better, with someone to help maintain it. Mercer dismounted and helped her down. I'm not asking you to give up your claim. You could keep it, work it in summer, stay here in winter, or sell it, or whatever you want. I'm just asking, why? Clara interrupted. Why me? There must be other women who'd marry you. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because you didn't quit. When everything went wrong, when you had every reason to give up, you kept going. You rode into a blizzard to help people you barely knew. You stayed with a family that wasn't yours because it was the right thing to do. He met her eyes. I spent 6 years in the army watching men break under pressure. You don't break, that's rare. That's worth something. Clara felt her throat tighten. That's not love. No, but it's respect and trust and partnership. Mercer's voice was steady. Maybe that's enough to build something on. Maybe it's more than enough. Clara looked at this man who'd saved her from Dalton's threats, who'd taught her to survive, who'd checked on her cabin and worried about whether she was alive. She thought about Thomas's pretty promises that meant nothing, and Mercer's practical offer that meant everything. I need time to think, she said. Take all the time you need. The offer stands. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts. Clara returned to her cabin and spent her days cleaning, repairing, preparing for the growing season. But she also rode to Mercer's ranch regularly, helping with work there, learning his routines, seeing what life might look like. Sarah visited one afternoon in late March, when green was finally starting to push through the dead grass. They sat outside Clara's cabin drinking coffee in actual sunshine. You're thinking about accepting his proposal, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. I am. Good. You'd be stupid not to. Sarah smiled. He's a good man. Hard to know. Harder to love, but worth the effort. I don't love him, Clara said quietly. Yet. You don't love him yet. Sarah refilled their cups. But you respect him, trust him. That's how most marriages out here start. The love comes later, if you're lucky. And I think you'd be lucky. Clara thought about that. About respect and trust and partnership being enough to build on, about the difference between promises and presents, about becoming someone she respected through surviving the things that should have killed her. In April, with wildflowers starting to bloom across the valley, Clara rode to Mercer's ranch and found him working in his barn. He looked up when she entered, something cautious and hopeful in his expression. I have an answer, Clara said, to your proposal. Mercer straightened, waiting. Yes, but with conditions. Name them. I keep my claim, I work it, improve it, and it stays mine. This marriage is a partnership, not me becoming your property. Agreed. We build an addition to your cabin. I need space that's mine. A room where I can work, read, have privacy. I'll start building tomorrow. And if this doesn't work, if we can't make it as partners, we end it honestly. No lies, no false promises. Clara met his eyes. I won't live through another man's broken promises. I'd rather be alone. I don't make promises I can't keep, Mercer said steadily. So here's mine. I'll work beside you, not above you. I'll share everything I have. I'll be honest even when it's hard, and I'll never ask you to be less than who you are. He paused. Is that enough? Clara thought about the woman who'd arrived at that train depot 9 months ago, desperate and betrayed and dependent on a stranger's word. Then she thought about who she'd become. Harder, capable, somebody who'd survived winter and saved a family and claimed her own piece of wilderness. It's enough, she said. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Sarah's ranch, with half the valley in attendance. Not because it was romantic, but because Clara Whitmore, the abandoned mail-order bride who'd refused to quit, had become something of a legend. The woman who'd survived alone, who'd walked through a blizzard to save strangers, who'd turned down comfort to choose independence, then chosen partnership on her own terms. The celebration was loud and chaotic, nothing like Clara had imagined a wedding would be. But standing beside Rhett Mercer with Sarah grinning and children running wild and the whole community gathered around them, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since before her mother died. She felt like she belonged. Summer came and Clara worked both properties, her original claim and Mercer's ranch. It was exhausting, but she'd learned exhausting. She grew a garden that actually produced food, raised chickens that provided eggs, improved her cabin until it was genuinely livable. Mercer helped with the heavy work, and she helped with his ranch, and slowly they built something that looked like a life. The Fletchers came to visit in July, the children healthy and loud, full of life. Mrs. Fletcher brought Clara a quilt she'd made, pieced together from scraps of fabric. "It's not much," she said, "but I wanted you to have something to remember." "I could never forget," Clara interrupted. "You gave me something too. You reminded me why any of this matters." They became friends after that, the way people do when they've survived something terrible together. The valley filled with stories about Clara, some true, some exaggerated, all of them painting her as something larger than life. The abandoned bride who became a homesteader, the city woman who saved a family, the proof that survival was possible if you were stubborn enough. Clara mostly ignored the stories. She was too busy living her life to worry about her legend. One evening in late summer, she and Mercer sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching the sun set over the valley. Their valley now in all the ways that mattered. Clara's claim papers were filed and legitimate. Mercer's ranch was thriving. Between them, they'd built something solid. "You ever regret it?" Mercer asked. "Coming west?" Clara thought about Philadelphia, about factory work and shared rooms and the slow death of having no future. She thought about Thomas's betrayal and her own fury, about learning to swing an axe and survive blizzards and help people who needed it. "No," she said. "I don't regret it." "Even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts." Clara leaned back, feeling the solid wood of the porch beneath her, the cool evening air on her skin, the presence of this man beside her who'd become her partner in all the ways that mattered. "The hard parts are what made me someone I actually like being." Mercer smiled, a real smile, not his usual almost smile. "I like who you became too." "Good. You're stuck with her now. Could be worse." Clara laughed and took his hand, and they sat together watching darkness fall over the wilderness they'd both learned to call home. She thought about the woman on that train platform, abandoned and afraid and certain her life was over. That woman had been wrong. Her life hadn't ended on that platform. It had started. Because sometimes the thing you thought would destroy you was actually the thing that set you free. Sometimes broken promises forced you to build something better. Sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to you turned out to be the beginning of everything worth having. Clara had learned the hard way that survival wasn't about comfort or safety or having someone else provide your future. It was about showing up every day and doing what needed doing, whether anyone was watching or not. It was about helping people who needed help and accepting help when you needed it. It was about building something real with your own scarred hands and refusing to quit even when quitting would be easier. She'd come west for a promise of marriage and found something better. A partnership earned through shared hardship, respect built on honest work, and the bone-deep certainty that she could survive anything because she already had. The abandoned woman who'd arrived with nothing had become the foundation of her own life. Not because someone chose her, but because she chose not to surrender. And that made all the difference.